In some previous videos, we took a look at the paint tools and how you could paint textures, various types of textures, whether it's diffuse or opacity and so on, to create materials for your meshes, your sculpts in Mudbox. There was one point that I forgot to make that I think is quite important, and we'll take a look at that now. And it's a matter of keeping all your assets organized. And what I mean by that is that when you start dealing with image textures using Mudbox, you're also dealing with various texture images that live as separate files. So let's take a look at what I mean here. Uh, Not going to do anything fancy here. We just have this simple sphere. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and save this scene here before I start anything. I'm going to go do a save scene as. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder for this. And I'm going to call this sample project. And then inside that folder, we'll call this sample test. Okay. So let's take a look at this folder that we just created. So here is my folder here for that sample project that I just created, and if I open up this folder, you'll notice that I only have one thing in this folder right now, and it is this sample test Mudbox scene. We're going to return back to Mudbox now and start painting some textures. So now that we're back in Mudbox, I'm going to right click on my mesh here, and I'm going to assign it a new material. I'm going to go ahead and just leave these defaults here. And we'll start painting a texture, and we'll start with a color texture. So I'm going to go to my layers, paint, and I'll go ahead and create a layer, and we'll use diffuse since that's going to be the color channel. In fact, I'll name it as well. Notice that my color layer I created is under diffuse, indicating that it's going to be for the color of this object here. So I'm going to select my paintbrush, and we'll go ahead and just make it, let's say, this green color here. And I'm going to go ahead and just flood the whole paint layer so that it's green entirely. And then we'll go ahead and start painting perhaps some red on it. Again, I'm not going to do anything fancy here. I'm not going to get into the stamps or stencils. You can look at that in some of the other videos that I've posted. But we'll just cover this up with some red splotch marks here. Okay, I think that's good. They're pretty evenly distributed over the mesh here. And now what I'm going to do is save my Mudbox scene. So I'll just go to File, Save. And we'll return to that folder that we created earlier. So here we are back in the folder here, my sample project folder that we created a few minutes ago. And what I'd like you to notice is that we still have our Mudbox scene in here. We also have this .bak file here. But what we're really looking at now is this extra folder that was created called Sample Test Files. I'm going to open that up and we'll see what's in there. And in fact, what you'll see are two textures. One is a very small, I'm not sure how big, 1 pixel by 1 pixel. No, actually it's 2 pixels by 2 pixels, which represents the background color for my my mesh, the original color that was assigned to that material. But this here is the texture that I just painted. And as you can see, it lives as a separate image file. If we wanted to take a look at it, here it is. Here is our color texture that we just painted directly onto the mesh. Let's take a look at a couple other material textures that we can create. I'm going to go ahead and create yet another layer, and we'll make this one specular. I'll say OK. We're in the specular layer here, and we will flood it. Let's try flooding it this very dark, almost black color here, and we'll flood the whole layer. As you can see, this got rid of most of the specularity on our mesh. And then I'm going to come over here and I'm going to change the color that I'm painting to something perhaps a almost white, but it's still gray. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint these red splotches. I'm not going to be super careful here. In fact, we'll just paint a few of them. But what you can see here is that we've got our specularity now on just those 3 or 4 splotch marks that we have there, and no specularity really on the green areas. Let's go ahead and save once again and return to our folder and check it out there. So here we are back in my sample project folder that we created at the beginning of this video. I'm going to double click once again on this folder that Mudbox created nested inside my folder that I made, and we'll see now that we have more textures, not just our color texture here that we created a little earlier, but we also have this other one which represents our specularity. Here's our color and our specularity textures that we've created in Mudbox. One thing to remember, I know we looked at this in an earlier video, but remember that with that specularity map here, or any other texture that you create in here, that you can right-click on the layer and you can do a solo as diffuse. And what that will do is it will show you, in this case, your specular map as a color map so that you can see what you've actually painted. When you want to go back to the regular view, simply right-click on the layer again and unsolo. So understanding actually that in Mudbox, these textures that we're painting, the fact that they live as separate image files is actually very powerful because it allows us to do some additional things, which we'll take a look at now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go over into Photoshop. Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. So here we are in Photoshop now, and we're looking at the color map. We could continue working on this color map here in Photoshop if we wanted. For instance, we could come in here and we could adjust the and shift the hues of our color. We could change the saturation, desaturate it, make it lighter, make it darker. We could paint directly on this. We can create brand new textures here in Photoshop. We can pretty much do whatever we want with our textures. A couple things to take note of. You'll notice that this texture here is 2048 by 2048. That's a good resolution typically for your textures, for your 3D models and sculpts. But let's see what we're going to do with this. We're going to try something a little bit different. We're going to come in here. I'm going to go to Select, Color Range, and I'm going to select the red areas. I might play a little bit with the fuzziness factor here. But we'll go ahead and select that. I'm going to create a new layer, And I will fill that in with white. Let's change our foreground color to white, and we'll go ahead and just drop that white color in there. And I'm going to invert my selection, or actually what I'll do is put a layer behind it, and then we'll just fill that with black. So this will be a new texture, and we'll save that. I'm going to save it as a TIFF, just like these other two that we created in Mudbox itself. I won't keep the layers. I don't need the layers, and I'll save it as, we'll call it opacity. And we'll return to Mudbox. So we're back in Mudbox. You already know that you can create a layer and select the opacity channel here, and you can paint directly on your mesh to create those transparencies. But what we're going to do is import what we created in Photoshop instead. So I'm going to actually delete this layer, and I'll right click in here in my layers, and we'll say import layer, select the material that we just created. Here it is, opacity, and I'll open that up. It's going to ask me what channel. I could apply it to any of these channels here, but we know that we want it on the opacity. And we'll say OK. And here we are. Now we have our transparency and our opacity here by using our opacity map that we created in Photoshop. One thing we can take a quick look at before wrapping up this video is something dealing with the transparency. To demonstrate this, what I'm going to do is create another mesh. We'll make a cube, and I'm going to scale this cube. Here's how you would do that, is you would come over here to the Select Move tools, and then you can select the Scale tool and scale it down so that it is inside this sphere. And oftentimes I've found in the past, and this is perhaps something that they've fixed, maybe Autodesk has fixed this, but oftentimes I've found that this is a problem when something else is behind an object with transparency. This actually seems to be working quite well. So perhaps it's something that Autodesk has fixed, which is great. But I would still test it a little more thoroughly before actually relying on Mudbox's transparency. Now, one other thing to take note of here is because I have two objects now, you can see that the cube is using the default shader. That's the reason why we wanted to create our original material earlier on. Otherwise, they would be both using the same material with transparency, which we might not want. But then the other thing is, how do you switch between these two? If I want to go back and paint on the texture for this object, you'll see that I no longer have the option because I currently have the cube selected. So we're not seeing its layers here in the layers area of our interface. So what can we do? Well, what I'm going to do is come over here to my object list and actually select my sphere. And then what I will do is I'll come over to Edit and say Deselect All. But because that was the last thing selected, you'll notice that if we go to our layers, we now have the sphere selected over here, and we can continue painting on it. The other thing I would mention with this is that if you have multiple meshes in your Mudbox scene, what you can also do to make it a little easier for you is, if I'm not currently working on that cube, I might just go ahead and click on it in my object list and hide it for the time being. Anyway, that's all for this video. I hope it's been helpful for you, and thank you for watching.